I've been hearing voices on the radio and people saying that the police are out to get me and usual sort of thing. But he said to me, but that can't be right, can it? Is it still important to have awareness of the cultural difference between what counts as normal in one society and what counts as normal in another, and to still have it in view, as it were, and not to allow it to completely disappear? Otherwise, as we have with mass migration, the movement of communities and individuals to new cultures can often result in them being diagnosed as having some mental illness or mental distress where it might not have counted as abnormal anywhere else. And Dinesh, I wonder if we could pick that up with you.
I think having sort of trained in one culture, having practiced in a different, firstly, no culture is homogeneous. So you can't sort of say, well, every British person will behave A, B, and C. But the point really is that sometimes we get into the habit of imposing diagnoses and assessment tools which have been developed in one culture blindly as if they're equally applicable. And to give you one example is that DSM-5 TR now, there is a condition called abnormal grief reaction. So if you have grief for longer than 6 months, you're mentally ill. Now, in certain cultures, for 11 months, there are things that you have to do, and you cannot have an happy event because that's a disrespect to the person who's died. So from that point of view, then everybody in that group becomes mentally ill, which is completely unacceptable, which then goes back to this notion as to who defines it and how do we respect that. And if I may give one example of many, many foolish years ago, I translated a questionnaire called Eating Attitude Test 21, which was developed in Canada. So we translated it into Hindi, back into English, back into Hindi, and we are very clever, we've done it right. I take it and give it to about 750 teenage girls in northern India. And we started looking at data. 37% of them had eating disorder. I said, this can't be right. So we went through each question, and the two questions which were creating major problems. One was, food controls my life. Now, if you're poor, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and therefore it's going to affect that. Second question, which was causing big problems, was that I cut my food into little pieces. Now, if you know Indian food and you're eating by hand, you're not going to, use bulk sums. You're going to have small amounts. So it was our foolishness to just kind of assuming that it will work. So that's the point, that we need to be aware of cultural relativism and see how things differ.
Yeah, and I wonder, Rose, whether those broader cultural norms are going to be just as important as the subjectivities you talked about, because obviously you're right, no culture is uniform and homogeneous, but do we still have to have those notions of a sort of norm around behaviour that people have been perpetrating and recommending, or should we just let it be subjectively decided?
I mean, I think the idea of norms is almost like synonymous with the word culture. Like every culture has its norms. It's just a case of not holding to those norms too rigidly. As I said in my introduction, my experiences could have been considered very abnormal for a teenage girl. But if you peel away the layers of context, actually they start to make a great deal of sense. I think the problem in psychiatry and the psych industries generally is that we have so few objective biomarkers to distinguish different conditions, and yet the kind of public narrative around mental health is You know, for example, my problems were characterized as like having like several different what they call comorbidities between different diagnoses. So OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, like bulimia. As a young person, in one sense, those diagnoses were quite comforting because I thought, oh, well, there's an explanation for what I've been through. And yet another part of me found it very difficult to get my head around like all these apparent like different parts of me. And it wasn't until I started to look at my problem through different lenses with psychedelics and other modalities and started to see the kind of trauma that was actually upstream of all those different manifestations of what I'd been told were discrete conditions. But yeah, it's very subjective. Like what I describe as intrusive thoughts, I have no idea what someone else's experience of intrusive thoughts is.
And this maybe comes back to the point of it being difficult to measure severity as well, as to what counts as severe for one person, not another. And Bessel, I was wondering whether, taking Rose's idea that sometimes in the face of the conditions you're subjected to, this is an incredibly normal way to respond, to think of all sorts of strategies to deal with it and get you out of there. So at what point do you think it's tipped over to the position where you think help is needed, or this person really ought to be given some advice?
Is it from the outside to the inside? I think psychiatry completely lost its way in terms of diagnoses, and we shouldn't even go there. I think, as I have been quoted to say, the DSM is a crock of shit. And I don't feel embarrassed about
so to say.
But this the outside and the inside. And what strikes me is the people who come to see me feel so ill themselves and are so judgmental about themselves and are so intolerant of themselves. And so we just finished this big MDMA study, gigantic study. I wrote my last empirical paper, and we found that people's relationship to themselves changes. And that is, we have never seen that before. I've never seen it before in any other study. People really saw themselves through new eyes with love and compassion. The word of love and compassion is forbidden language in psychiatric literature, so I couldn't say love and compassion. Compassion I could say about lovers, well, I couldn't say. So that people can change their attitudes about themselves. So there's one thing, it's the judgment of other people, but even worse, it's the judgment about yourself. And these things are oftentimes out of sync with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I want to come back to the severity point as well. I mean, I take the point about how people thinking about themselves is very important here. But the severity point, maybe it's worth addressing the fact that when we all look at DSM-5 and we read through the definitions, we say, oh, I've got that, I do this. But as my colleague, psychologist Chris Frith says, you only need to worry when you've got all the criteria met, right? So is it that, yes, we're all a little bit overlapping with some of these, but severity could at least get you, Frank, to think in some cases, when you tick all the boxes, this is where it's really become an issue for intervention or help?
Yes, I mean, I think we're all agreed that the concept of normality only exists in relation to a specific population. The word normal refers to normal distributions. And, I think that the problem is that you really have to know your reference population if you're going to make these kind of decisions about how severe something is. I mean, in the 1960s, people like R.D. Laing were suggesting that effectively we live in an abnormal world, and one of the rational responses to that is psychosis, that indeed psychosis isn't an illness, but a sort of strategy for coping in a world that is extremely abnormal. So he kind of reverses it. And so he's obviously very critical of what he called, senescent capitalism, the cultural background against which diagnoses are made. But you do have to know the population. The American writer Jonathan Rosen has written an extraordinary book called The Best Minds, which studies the history of diagnoses, among many other things. And he takes these sort of Langian ideas and he's quite critical of them, in the sense that, so in the 1960s, people suffering from psychoses were recast as like foot soldiers of the revolution, were compared to people from shamanistic societies. And shamanistic indigenous cultures usually value individuals who hear voices, see visions, and this is thought to be, culturally significant. And so this was taken to be some kind of justification. But in fact, Rosen makes the point that if you actually go to many of these indigenous cultures and shamanistic societies, yes, they have shamans, but they also are perfectly aware that there are some people who are a danger to themselves and to the rest of society, i.e. they are severely ill insofar as they are a threat to themselves and others. And so I think, you have to know the culture before you can make sort of broad generalizations. And even someone like Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Gustav Jung was someone who pretty much at the end of his life rejected the whole idea of diagnosis and illness. For him, he thought that the emphasis should fall on personal growth, and that really you should, if you have an illness or a problem, or what we call an illness, it's something that really you can't resolve and you have to outgrow it. Indeed, that was his final recommendation. But even someone like him, whose whole psychology was based on what might have been a psychotic breakdown. He said that perhaps he did flirt with madness during a period when he formulated all of his most important ideas for his therapy. Now, even Jung made a distinction when it came to severity. So the great writer, James Joyce, had a daughter, Lucia, who suffered from a psychotic illness. And Joyce took Lucia to see Jung. And he said, Dr. Jung, have you noticed how me and my daughter are submerged in the same waters? And Jung said, yes, yeah. But where you swim, she drowns. And Jung was, of course, someone who was, very, very aware of the subtleties of psychotic experience. But he was certainly aware also that sometimes one has to think perhaps more medically about a problem than transpersonally.
But is it always cultural, this idea of what's normal? I had a PhD student, very, very clever man, who had schizophrenic episodes, and with medication, he was fine, but found that dampened down his sort of mental life, and he would occasionally sort of go without medication. And I remember one time him coming to see me and saying, I've been hearing voices on the radio and people saying that the police are out to get me, and usual sort of thing. But he said to me, but that can't be right, can it? And I thought that was very interesting. He was intelligent enough to hold in view that the compellingness of the evidence from the inside, but to reason that's probably not an accurate portrayal of how the world is actually working. So I wonder if it always has to be a normal notion in psychiatric terms, or whether we can't sometimes appeal to just how does the world work.
Well, I think Jonathan Rosen actually refers to the tragedy.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.